Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters. And for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the Safe Camp Audio Network. Check out our show page and all of Safe Camp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web, at Safe Camp Audio on all social media. So normally on the first Monday of the month, we would roll with the headlines edition of the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I thought since the mother of all headlines is coming tomorrow on November 5th, we would hold off and try to incorporate the presidential election into this month's headlines. So today we are going to feature our interview with Dawn Post. We've had Dawn on the podcast before. She's a veteran attorney for youth and foster care, particularly those who have experienced a failed adoption. To that effect, Post has just recently launched Themis Youth Law and Advocacy with a mission to fight for abandoned and discarded youth by engaging in legal services and advocacy to address broken adoptions, sibling visitation, and institutional child abuse and neglect in residential facilities for youth both nationally and abroad. And we touch on most of those subjects in this conversation because Post joined me to debrief on a truly crazy and very tragic crisis that she recently worked on that involved 8 American children who were placed by their parents in a residential program in Jamaica where conditions were bad enough that the Jamaican government intervened and removed them all. Post represented all of the kids who were involved here. All of them are now back in the United States now, and it's really not clear, honestly, if that would be the case had she not gone down there pro bono and repped all of them. It's a crazy story. I definitely think there are kind of through lines between what happened here and other bigger, broader issues in child welfare. So let's get right to it. Here is our interview with Dawn Post, founder of Themis Youth Law and Advocacy. All right, we are joined by Dawn Post, legendary attorney for children in foster care and a returning guest to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. We're having her because she played a part in a really crazy story that touches on what can happen when youth are sent to faraway residential care facilities, what happens when adoptions fail, in particular for older youth, and more than that. So we're going to get into it. We'll take this in 3 parts and talk about the residential care program in Jamaica that Dawn got involved with, the one adopted youth who was living there and came home to find no home. And we'll talk about a possible law in New York that might make that state the leader on tracking adoption stability on some level. So, Dawn, thanks for coming back on the Imprint Weekly Podcast to talk about all this.
Thank you so much, John. This is the place to have this conversation, to really, really get out to child welfare leaders what the issues are and the risks that are happening in terms of youth being sent away that I don't think I ever anticipated. And it was not on my radar, even though I've done a lot of work on broken adoptions.
You have the context and the story, and that's why I think it's important for us to kind of capture this. So we're going to, I didn't really plan for this. We're just going to talk. I mean, I know enough about it to ask Dawn, and she can tell you everything that happened. As per rules here on the podcast, before we get into that, I got to ask you to tell these guys one of your favorites. I went back and listened the last time you recommended metal, which I share a love of that with you, but you in particular recommended the Mongolian metal band Hue. So try and top that.
Well, I was such an unusual kid. I grew up in the middle of nowhere, no TV. And my favorite book when I was 11 was One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And my 6th grade teacher was a little taken aback when I recommended that we have that as class reading. So that was at one time my favorite book.
I would say that would be weird for an 11-year-old, but then by like 6 years later, you were in court representing people. So
yes,
I guess
exactly.
Age adjusted for your experience, that was good to go.
Exactly.
All right. So this all starts with a situation where the Jamaican government responding to reports that it received of abusive conditions at a residential facility called the Atlantis Leadership Academy, which is on its territory in Jamaica, went in and removed, I've heard it as 7 or 8 youth who were American citizens who were in this facility, and they took them into Jamaican custody, correct?
That is correct. And it was 8.
It
However,
was 8.
one had turned 18, so he was immediately returned to the United States.
I see.
The other 7 were placed in the custody of Jamaican and Child Protective Services. And I want to note, it wasn't just that these kids were American citizens. This was an American-owned facility. And for anyone who watched the program, Cons, Cults, and Kidnapping, that was on Netflix, which talked about WASP programs, there were WASP connections with respect to the owner of this facility, Randy Cook, when he opened this quote unquote boarding school to house youth.
So obviously now you've got to know this place and what all went on there, but what can you tell us about Atlantis Academy? The grounds, what the day was like there. We'll get into the allegations of what went wrong there, but what was a youth's day like, and how did they come to be there?
Sure. So it was interesting to see that of all the boys that were there, they were all system involved in some way when they were sent, which was disturbing to realize, because it meant that in some ways that systems might have been implicitly consenting to youth being removed from the jurisdiction when they were under child protective investigations, when a child was on probation. And in one instance, it was special education funding from a county that was paying for this youth to be at this boarding school where they were not being offered an education. If they had any, it was intermittent and it was simply online classes. But their days were spent with doing very hard, what they called hell workouts. And they were put into stress positions that they would have to hold for hours at a time. Between them and the staff, they only had 1 chicken and sosa rice, which was unbuttered, unsalted rice that had to be divided amongst all of them for 1 day. And so their portions of food were really insubstantial. And we actually met a woman who assisted at the facility, and she would try to bring in fresh avocados or some of her own food occasionally to slip to the boys, but she would get in trouble for that. And she was also concerned about retaliation.
Sorry to interrupt, but the way you just described it, they're trying to bring it in. This is not an economic situation for the school. That is it's a boot camp. They are depriving as a strategy.
It was absolutely a boot camp. However, I don't know if it was an intentional boot camp, because certainly the parents were paying enough money. And so it's somewhat difficult to understand how they got evicted for non-payment. So they moved twice. So all of the photographs with respect to the beautiful residence, that actually did not exist, at least for the last year. And no one really knows where all the money went. However, it certainly didn't go into the care of the kids. And the people that were working there were being paid even less than minimum wage per Jamaican standards. It was really astounding to learn how little they received. But we know the Americans' parents were paying a lot of money for this place.
So just to square that circle, because you mentioned that there were system involved, all 8, but that their parents were involved in the decision. We're not talking here about kids, or am I wrong, that were in foster care. Special education, that was their plan. That was like an alternative plan for their schooling. Correct. Or in maybe other cases, it was their behavior and a parent was paying out of pocket for this experience for them.
Correct. So when I say that they were system involved, it's not like when I worked at A Better Childhood and I was helping bring class action lawsuits when there were so many foster kids being placed in the for-profit behavioral health industry. This is a little bit different. And so when I say system involved, it means that they were connected in the system in some way. So there was some knowledge in the systems about these kids being sent away. And one of my greatest concerns were, at least when the family was in the midst of a child protective investigation, that this child said he was the subject of abuse, and they knew he was being sent away as a solution, and that was deemed acceptable by the local CPS.
Okay, so the parent on some level is green lighting the admission here and paying either with their money or a portion of them and some school
in all
fare
of the
or whatever.
instance, yes.
And the kids are picked up, they're sent to Jamaica.
Yeah. Many of them were referred by educational consultants who the parents had, some of the parents I think were well-meaning and were really just trying to find solutions and were at the end of their rope. And this seemed to be more affordable than others. So I think that there is an issue with respect to educational consultants who were, I believe, and I allege, getting kickbacks for the referrals. But then you also have the professional teen transporter industry. And so they would take over power of attorney to get these kids passports, and were doing the transporting themselves, threatening the boys with shackles if they didn't cooperate. And so from the moment they were picked up, it was an abusive situation.
And then they get there and their day, if I'm hearing you right, largely consists of, I'm going to guess, waking up very early and then not having a lot of food, doing online kind of perfunctory, not enriching school, and then a lot of not manual labor, or are we talking more just exercise, a lot of exercise?
More exercise, not manual labor, but some of their punishments were also just isolation. And there was one particular stool that was taller than an average stool that they would have to sit on for days at a time looking at the wall, which is not unusual in youth I've spoken to in these type of facilities that have been in isolation. So there was that component as well. But the owner didn't actually visit the program that often. It was actually being run by a gentleman who used to work at Tranquility Bay, which was a facility that was closed in the 2000s after extreme abuse was reported there. And it was located in the exact same town as Atlantis Leadership Academy. Anyway, he used to work at Tranquility Bay, and he was now running everything at Atlantis Leadership Academy, what I'll also call ALA. And it was a lot of, in terms of what the boys indicated in their handwritten statements and also in my conversations with them, you never knew what to expect on a day-to-day basis because there were constant threats, there were constant aggressions, staff were getting drunk, they were betting on the kids in fight clubs. Local football club allegedly also came in and was taking bets on the kids. And so there was no real standard day, I should say. The boys' statements are just filled with stories about like a black mamba, which was this particular whip that had been made with beads in it that was to be used on the boys, and how they would have to use it on each other. And so they were really unable to develop friendships, and they were, frequently threatened with knives and other instruments. There was some waterboarding allegedly that occurred where they would tip the heads back and then put hoses up the children's nose and mouth. So we're talking some really extreme
sadistic
acts, really sadistic.
Yeah.
And so when I became involved, it was completely random. I was contacted by Chelsea Maldonado, who is an investigator and researcher in the troubled teen industry, and particularly for a podcast, Trapped in Treatment. And she knew of my interest in working with broken adoptions and the fact that I have done a lot of study and publishing and lectures about it in the US. And so she contacted me to say, I've heard about this situation in Jamaica. There are these kids that are in Jamaica's custody, and the parents don't want them. And 3 of the kids are adopted. And so initially, because I'm, on my own, at this point, I'm not working for another nonprofit. I wasn't sure if I would go, but after speaking with the embassy and confirming that I might be of some assistance, and it wasn't only assistance in terms of the boys, but also for the Jamaican government, because as you know, and anyone who's listening knows, every state system is very, very different. It's complex. There are a lot of hurdles. And I was hoping to be able to help educate officials there as well to be able to help navigate getting the kids back.
So at this point, when you jump into this situation, the Jamaican government has already taken these young men out of the place, and they are now at Jamaican group homes.
That's correct.
Yeah.
At the point that I became involved, I think they had been there they were in Jamaica's custody about 45 days.
Yeah.
And so I came in about a month and a half into it. And so I flew there on my dime to be able to offer my services pro bono. I only intended to stay for the first court appearance, but then when I realized the amount of work and that needed to be done on the ground, I ended up staying 3 weeks to be able to get to the next court appearance. And so with the 3 adopted boys, it was clear their adoptive parents did not want to plan for their return to the United States.
All 3
adopted boys, who also happen to be the boys of color, and allegedly were not being responsive to either the embassy or to CPFSA, which is Child Protective Services in Jamaica. And so I began my own outreach as well. But in the conversations that we had in trying to do planning for these young men, we talked about, can we find, another person who will file for guardianship for them? Will a state system bring them into custody if we can get them back into the US? And so I had this tier of, plans that I was going through trying to work, different results for each youth.
So Jamaica's interest at this point is like, we want these kids out of here. We want to figure out how to transport them back to where they are from. And for the young people who were biological children, that went fairly quickly.
It didn't go quickly because Jamaican authorities also asked for parents to participate in home studies through International Social
Oh, really?
Service,
Okay.
ISS.
Yeah.
Which I think actually was reasonable because I think there was some question in their mind as to
like what kind of parent would send their kid to this place.
Exactly. And so I think that made sense. And also, much like we have an ICPC, I think that would be their version of it. So I think that they did the right thing. Mm-hmm. I don't think anyone can grasp how much of a burden this was on the Jamaican system to bring these boys into care. This is not a robust system. Even the director of the country was driving the kids around because there was no one else to do the transporting. It took a tremendous amount of resources away from Jamaican kids who could have used it, but they did the right thing. And we're trying to find ways for the boys to get back. I did work cooperatively with some of the biological parents and was able to help, get together paperwork, quickly, be able to provide them, a better understanding of what was happening. Part of the confusion of what was happening initially, I believe, is that Atlantis Leadership Academy was trying to stay open. So they were telling all the parents, all the kids are liars. They're all manipulators. They're just trying to, destroy your family. They're going to come back and destroy your family. And then they were telling the boys, no one will ever believe you, this type of thing. And so the parents were hearing from the Atlantis Leadership Academy attorney, don't cooperate, things will be back to normal shortly. They'll all be back in the program and you won't have to worry about it anymore. Yeah. And so I think there was a lot of misinformation in the beginning, which prevented bio families from coming forward. So I was able to assist with a few families, but with respect to the 3 adoptees in Jamaica, by day 60, if there has not been reunification or a return to the parent, then the boys were put into the permanent custody of Jamaica, which, was then a complete, interference of the parents' rights. And so I had hoped to have gotten the boys out of the country by that point, but I had no idea the stumbling blocks that I would have received in terms of getting answers from our federal and state systems, from the many, many advocates that I contacted all over the country and the boys' home states. It was incredibly complicated, and maybe it was naive on my part to think that it would have gone more smoothly, but I never could have anticipated that it would take 7 months. to get a kid back, which was this last one. And that was only because I think Jamaica finally gave up and as a last resort deported him and say, US, you figure it out. And that's when for this last teenager who ended up in Miami, there became this issue of, does his home state in Michigan take him in, or is the port of entry Miami taking him in? And there was some argument and dispute about that.
Okay. Before we get to that young man's story, I want to ask, obviously you can't know this. How do you think this would have played out had you not gone down there and represented these 8? On some level you represented all 8 of them, right?
Yep,
So, I mean,
no, they signed
how would this have happened?
I believe that the school might have been reopened. If no one had, if the media wasn't as aware of the situation as it was, based upon the advocacy of the 1111 Charitable Arm Foundation of the Paris Hilton's company, if Chelsea Maldonado was also not there, if we were not constantly in contact with CPFSA and the embassy, I do believe that this is something that might have, people would have tried to slip it under the rug. We've seen this happen time and time again, even in the US, when places are under investigation, things die down and then they just start back up under different names with different licenses. And so I do think that that might have happened had we not become involved.
And most, if not all of these children might still be there.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Dawn mentioned something there that we should not completely sidestep here. That Paris Hilton and her media charitable arm were pretty instrumental in building some awareness of this. And she actually showed up at the hearing.
She did.
It's a pretty big deal. I mean, that's got to be something when you're just having a hearing you have like all the time, and then Paris Hilton walks in to watch it. It's got to be.
And
something.
she didn't go into the courtroom. She wanted to be there to give a hug to the boys and say, I believe you. And I'll tell you, you cannot fake, being around kids and teenagers, particularly who may have some behavioral issues or other mental health issues. And she was incredibly genuine, which I did not anticipate in the way that she was. She's been trying to bring awareness to this for a long time. And so she flew in just for that day to bring greater awareness to their plight, because there is no reason that they should have languished in Jamaica for as long as they did.
I think that one thing she and her group there should really take some credit for is I've just been, I've been covering this for a long time. And in the 2010s, there was this energy around regulating these places that largely deal with parents who send their kids to residential, wilderness, whatever. And then there were more recently been a movement to limit and regulate congregate care within like the foster care system and juvenile justice. And, it's that teaming up of her and, folks like yourself or Sixto and Think of Us and all these different people that have kind of made it, this is just an issue with how we treat kids when they're out of sight.
Exactly.
And like, it doesn't matter on some level whether their parent can afford to do it or they get money from a school system to do it or it's foster care, figure this out or stop doing it.
Exactly.
Which I think is kind of a powerful thing. In your experience, I mean, you've talked to so many different young people about this, but like in your experience, are there a lot of places, even in the US, where those populations actually exist in the same facility? Or do you find that it's pretty austere? No,
I think that there are these type of places that do exist in the US. I think they're in the states that have more religious exemptions. Mm-hmm. So they have no licensing and no oversight with respect to what's going on in their group homes. And they're religious based, which also has its own set of issues in terms of treatment of children sometimes in some of these facilities. So it's a risk here in the US. And Paris Hilton is sponsoring and working with legislatures to pass SICA, Stop Institutional Child Abuse Act. And that's something that she's very active doing, but it's true. It's brought together a community of people that normally wouldn't have interacted, because I was always a little hands off with the troubled teen industry because I felt like it might take away from seeing that there were poor youth of color, socioeconomic disadvantaged youth that were also in these facilities and their voices weren't being heard. through this process, I was shocked to learn, given how much work I've done in broken adoptions, that there's such a large percentage of youth who are adopted who are being not only placed in these facilities, but abandoned. And while I was in Jamaica, I learned of another facility there called Youth Vision Academy, YOVA, which has 150 to 170 adopted youth that say, and primarily adopted out of foster care in the United States. And they say that they treat reactive attachment disorder. However, when I investigated the leadership, I discovered that they all worked at a facility, or three of the leaders worked at a facility in the US that was closed for the sadistic torture of children, Miracle Meadows in West Virginia. And those settlements in that case were for over $100 million. So they had actually left, reopened in St. Lucia. I've gotten their certificate of incorporation, again, American owned, and then moved to Jamaica. And so I've been interviewing survivors from YOVA who are also describing some incredible abuse that's taking place, and very reminiscent of what happened at Miracle Meadows. And this is the issue with sending kids outside of the country, is that there's a reason why facilities are opening there. There's no oversight, there's no licensing, and no one's checking in. And what Jamaica did was incredibly unusual. And in terms of bringing kids into care, even though it was such a strain on their resources. And I'm not sure Jamaica is prepared to do that now with YOVA, with so many kids. There's 170, though I do know the Canadian government has recently rescued 3 of their own. But this really bears scrutiny. There's also a facility in Mexico called Sunset Bay Academy, which also, has very hellish conditions as described to me by the youth that have gone there. So through this process, and I realized to my shame that I didn't know how many adopted youth were being placed in these facilities and then abandoned, because one of the success stories at ALA was saying, we kept this boy till he was 18. He was adopted. His adopted parents didn't want him back in the US. And when he turned 18, we dropped him off in Miami with $50. That was it. And so that was a success story. And then the boys were threatened with this success story saying, well, you know what? He actually got shot, and that's what's going to end up happening to you. And what I've learned also with YOVA and some of the survivors is that their adoptive families made no plans to have them return to the United States. They would have to work to get their ticket back to the US, or they were brought to states that they had no connection to, where they became homeless. So this is a much bigger problem, I think, not only in terms of the populations that are in the international facilities, but also here in some of the US facilities. I've heard of another facility that the majority of kids are adopted. And anecdotally, a lot of people are saying this, but I think there's at least one study of wilderness camps that said up to 30% of teens were adopted that were being placed in these institutions.
150 in another country. It's very alarming.
All parts of that investigation are alarming. And so I'm really screaming into the void about that, doing some advocacy. So as a result of all of this, and I had not intended on opening a nonprofit for a few years yet. So I bit the bullet, and I have now opened a nonprofit law firm, Themis Youth Law and Advocacy. Themis is the goddess of justice. So I started that process while I was in Jamaica, but it is to advocate for abandoned, discarded children and youth. And that could be by their families. It could be by the systems. There's a lot of reasons. There's a lot of ways to interpret that. And so I'll be going public very, very shortly with that nonprofit, and we'll be able to accept donations at that point as 501c3 paperwork has been filed. But yeah, I didn't expect that's where my life was going to be right now. But I am very passionate about these issues, and working with these teens in the way that I have, and always been about direct advocacy and lived experience and having youth voice and making an impact. And so I really see that there's gaps in our federal and state systems, and there's a lack of advocacy for these youth. There's a lack of voice for these youth because oftentimes they're so isolated. And so I see there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
That's incredible. Themis will be a good heavy metal band name too. thing.
That it would be a great heavy metal.
Before I was adopted, I felt like my life was already over.
My biggest fear was that I would age out and not know how to be sufficient on my own.
At a certain age, like, they don't want you, you're troubled and stuff.
The clock is ticking for the more than 125,000 kids waiting to be adopted from foster care. Help the Dave Thomas Foundation for Adoption prevent them from aging out without a permanent family. Learn more at davethomasfoundation.org.
So let's talk about one young man you're still in the life of and representing here. His name is Elijah. He's a 17-year-old who you have represented in this case. He was the last one left in Jamaica, and one of the three you described before who was an adoptee whose adoptive parents were not participatory in any way and did not wish to have him back, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And this is also straight from, what their attorneys would say in court. They did hire Jamaican attorneys who would say, no, the parents don't want him back. All three of those adoptive parents have said this, that, just send him back to foster care in the US as if it's that easy.
Who said that?
The Jamaican attorneys who were representing the parents in the Jamaican court system. And so, yes, so as a last resort, and he was sent to Miami. And so at that, I literally found out, the Friday before Labor Day weekend that he was flying in on Tuesday, and that his parents had signed over guardianship or power of attorney, and I never saw these papers, to a teen transporter who was going to take him to live with him in Utah. And this was the same teen transporter who had threatened all the boys with shackles when he would transport them to Atlantis Leadership Academy.
Are these people like attached to a corporation, or is this just some guy with a van that somebody knows and does this? Like, what is this?
No, this transporter does run. He's on two different websites, and they're called, I think one is called Global Trafficking something, but they style them.
It's a great choice.
I might actually be replacing the name.
Okay.
That's completely wrong. Yeah. Global Transporting Services, probably.
Coyote Inc.
Yeah, I think trafficking is, because that's what I always think of them as. But he was the one that was involved in all their transports. And not only that, he wrote a letter in support of Atlantis Leadership Academy, saying that all the kids were liars and manipulators and that it was a wonderful, wonderful place. And so this is who they had given guardianship to. So I had contacted Florida Child Protective Services. I showed up in Miami. And again, I think if I had not been there, this would have turned very, very differently. But I was able to ensure that he did not have to leave with that transporter. And ultimately, after some negotiation and conversations, Florida Child Protective Services took him into custody in a special proceeding, and then the next day transported him to Michigan.
So just to be clear on what was going to happen.
Yeah.
If this transporter was taking it to Utah, then I'm assuming that means the parents had paid them and had also found a taker for Elijah in Utah. So they had made arrangements to do that?
Yeah, they had made the arrangements. They paid him to do this, but the arrangement was that Elijah would have to live with the transporter. And he would he would have absolute control over Elijah's life. And I've seen some of the things he's written where he said, this is no longer about Elijah's way. Everything's going to be done my way, and very hostile and aggressive. And so this was, not an adequate plan in terms of a youth has been traumatized in the way that this young person has multiple times, from the abuse to the abandonment and his prior history, in terms of, as a refugee in Haiti. So it appeared, and what I believe and I allege is that the parents still believed that all the boys are liars and manipulators, and that he was that he was poisoning their family is the word that they used. And so I interrupted that plan. And partly, we had communicated very extensively extensively with Child Protective Services in both states to say, these are all the concerns about this man. He's not a family friend. He's not doing this out of the goodness of his heart. He has, these allegations have been made against him. But it was very, very hard to get state systems to see the issue with that. And I'm not sure, at least in Michigan, if race played a part in it. I think that there is this phenomenon of when young Black boys hit adolescence, they're perceived as more threatening in some ways. And there's these assumptions made about them, particularly as they are, growing more into Black culture and other things. And these were all white Christian fundamentalist families, which also played a huge role in this. But I did get the undercurrent of race when I experienced discussing the issues with Child Protective Services in Michigan, where they just simply looked at him as a bad kid. And so they were willing to just buy anything that allegedly, I believe, that the adoptive parents were saying, in that they did. The adoptive parents' defense, as I understand it, is that they were advised not to go to Jamaica because they might be arrested. Other parents went and got their kids. So I'm not sure where that happened. Or they were advised not to go because it's a dangerous country. Yes, in the State Department list, the rating is high. However, you sent your son there. So that also seemed a little strange.
And I think you just also pinpointed the ugly thing that surfaces here, which is there's not a legal difference between what you would do for your adopted son and what you would do for your biological son, Yet there were 3 kids that were left there and they were all adopted kids, and that's not an indictment of every adopter of a kid, especially older kids, but it's there, it's out there. And it's just as you're describing this, it's almost like there's like this implicit possible alternative way this stuff plays out for an adoptive parent who doesn't feel like they want to take the child back into their house versus a biological parent.
I've argued this for years in terms of adoptive parents being held to a different standard. And this I saw repeatedly in court cases that I handled in New York City, that somehow they should get a pass because their poor adoptive parent have to put up with so much. I'm sorry, but some of these youth, it was merely normal adolescent behavior that ends up being pathologized. And I think that was true in Elijah's case, and so I spent a week with him in a hotel, just a few doors down, because in a very unusual circumstance, when he got flown back to Michigan CPS wouldn't even interview him. They left him outside of the Child Protective Office for 4 hours waiting for me to fly in as I was directly behind him, and they wouldn't even interview him. They just said, your parents are good parents, and this is an appropriate plan for you to now get on a plane to Utah to go live with this trafficker. And so I landed. We ended up in agreement and I ended up paying for a hotel. And actually the whole time, during that initial period, we were paying for everything for Elijah, his hotel room, his meals, everything else. And in a very unusual circumstance, I ended up working with a local attorney who ended up also doing this pro bono, where we filed a case on behalf of Elijah against his parents, alleging abuse and neglect, but particularly the abandonment, and asking for placement in foster care. And so the department was not even as a party at that point. So that's a very unusual proceeding. I'm not sure if it's even been done in Michigan, but it was accepted. And so that is ultimately how we were able to get Elijah placed in foster care. But I ended up, because of the people that ended up coming forward, and I must say, people from his former life in terms of coaches and teachers, incredible amount of support of people who said he was always such a great kid. We loved him. He was a great track star. We always wondered what happened. We tried to find him, but his parents wouldn't tell us. And so a lot of people came forward, and I ended up interviewing quite a few to be able to find a placement resource. and ultimately ended up finding a really lovely couple who wanted to open their home to Elijah as foster parents. And so they are currently going through that licensing process.
And how's he doing now?
I think today's his first day of school, as I understand it. So he just wants normalcy. He wants to be back on a track team. He wants to be, because he's lost 2 years of education. He, has to catch up. And so a lot of people are stepping forward to be tutors and other things, and I think he honestly believed that no one in the world cared about him. And after so long being told, no one's ever going to believe you, no one ever wants you, and then being left in a country isolated with no way to contact the outside world, it's been amazing for him to be able to see and feel and hear all these words of support and encouragement. And, and also just the provision of physical items, because he had nothing. And so, we provided some of the things, but a lot of members of the community did as well. So that has been really uplifting for him. So I think he's in a much better place, but obviously it's going to take a long time to get over what has happened and to achieve the normalcy that he is striving for.
So he is with a foster family now.
Not quite yet. He's in a group home.
Okay, but on the way.
Foster family is becoming certified. Okay. So, but they're able to see him and take him out, and then they are making things as normal for him as possible.
Very cool. Now, as we mentioned, there were two other young men who were left behind there. One is the adopted son of a former Kentucky governor, Matt Bevins. The other is, I think you mentioned to me before we started this, living in Illinois, but what's their current situation?
So the Matt Bevins son, he is in a placement that I helped identify that he's in a safe and appropriate place. He's not in the state of Kentucky, but he's elsewhere and getting the help that he needs. The third I'm more concerned about, he was released to another family in Chicago, and now he's being bounced around. And so this has literally happened in the last 24 hours. And I'll tell you one thing I do not miss about doing direct advocacy is waking up in the middle of the night to seeing emergency text messages like help. And so that's cropped back into my life now doing direct services work, but I'm going to be advocating for him now differently than what I've been doing before.
Am I correct that there are possible charges being considered or having been filed against the Michigan teen's parents?
So this is something that has come from him. I'm not sure. I certainly am very curious to know if this has happened, but I have heard that there might be fraud charges with respect to the subsidy continuing to be paid all of this time that they were no longer caring for him and had no plans on caring for him in the future.
I was kind of thinking as we were talking about this, that it seems like it would be a clarifying thing for this field if there was some sort of lawsuit, not to like speak that into the world in this case, I don't mean it like that. How am I going to say this? That puts some more clarity behind what it means to abandon a kid.
Oh, 100%.
After, right? Like, are you not, if you are a parent of some means, but you don't want your adopted son living with you, and you are willing to pay whoever the last taker, the taker of last resort is, so that they don't live with you, is that not abandonment?
Exactly.
Like, or what? Like, what are we talking about here?
Yeah. And there's the difference of, the emotional deprivation versus physical deprivation of needs, but I can say for the boys that were in Jamaica, and this is, again, what a suck and drain this was on Jamaican resources, but the parents never sent anything to the boys. We provided some of the things. They would call us if the boys needed anything for birthdays, or things like that. But, these were families with means that could have helped and chose not to.
Yeah. Yeah. So Dawn, just a minute ago, mentioned the word subsidy. I don't want to glide past this and assume people know about this, but basically there is a sort of practice in this country of providing adoption subsidies in the form of monthly payments, usually to parents who adopt youth out of foster care. That is kind of financed most of the time through a partnership between the federal government through what's called the Title IV entitlement and state funds. So you're getting financial support up till like they're 21, theoretically, you could.
That's correct.
Yeah.
States can take on full responsibility between 18 and 21, and some do.
So you can elaborate past this, but if I recall from our many conversations about this when I was writing about it before, there kind of is there is a way, there are standards for maintaining that subsidy, but there's not any requirement to see if those things are being met, and almost every state does not track it. That nobody is really home to check to see, does this adoptive parent indeed still have the kid? And we should be providing
absolutely
something.
Correct, because I was working with so many teens that were homeless or in other circumstances, and the money goes till 21, and there's no way to stop that subsidy. States do not often jump in to stop it unilaterally for a variety of reasons. And some of it is the way that the federal guidance is written. The most egregious example was in New York. Adoptive father killed an adoptive mother and continued to receive the adoption subsidy while, he was in jail, and the 4 kids were back in foster care. And we see it all the time. And part of it also has to do that the word support is not well defined. So if you get a birthday card from the parent, is that support? If they give you a pair of socks, is that enough support? Or because they're maintaining a home that theoretically, even though they have said they don't want you, you could return to, is that, reason to continue to pay the subsidy?
But isn't the main problem that, let's take that hypothetical where somebody was trying to say, oh, well, I send a birthday card on their birthday, so I still support them. There are probably plenty of judges who would look at that, scoff, and take their subsidy away. The problem is that there is no procedure for finding those people and bringing them before a judge, correct?
Correct. And I shouldn't even say that, because here, kids are voluntarily placed back into foster care, in significant numbers. Lawyers for Children, which is one law firm that represented voluntary placements, 1/5 of their caseload were adopted children that were returned to foster care. That was 200 kids. So, and the adoptions continue to be paid. So it wasn't unknown. Right. But there's this question, the judge can't really terminate it. It's really the responsibility of Child Protective Services. And since 2017, we've been trying to get legislation passed here in New York to be able to better address this issue. And I think we would be the first state to do it. However, again, it's been 2017 trying to do this. And while it passed the New York legislature, it has not yet been put before the governor for signature or signed by the governor. And so, adoptive parents also have a powerful voice and are very resistant to having oversight in terms of their care of their children. They believe that they stand in the same constitutional footprint as biological parents, which is true. However, when you accept money for the care of someone, just as if you're getting food stamps or if you're getting, any other forms of federal assistance that you have to do reporting requirements on, why can't we do better reporting requirements and follow up with respect to adoptive parents?
Now, how does the New York legislation work that is, in the pipeline now, but has not, to your point, been signed by the governor? Like, what is the way in which they will patrol? There might be somebody listening. It's like, do the adoptive parents have a point? Is it overly cumbersome, or is this like a pretty pretty basic check on status? Like, how does it work?
Well, there's already a basic check on status. The problem is that in New York, what would happen is that you would have to send back a form, which is called an educational form, certifying that your teen is still receiving an education. But we know that who's checking to make sure, 1, the form is returned, or 2, that it's actually accurate. And so we don't even know how many are not being returned. This allows for when a child shows up and says, I'm homeless, then to make further inquiries and to be able to, take more action. And it follows federal guidance that was released a few years ago, so it's not totally out of left field, but codifying into law so we don't just have federal guidance, I think is a really significant step.
Dawn Post, legal expert extraordinaire, saver of kids from very bad situations. I was certainly proud to know you when I read all about this stuff, and thank you so much for joining us on the Imprint Weekly podcast.
Well, thank you, and follow my new metal band.
There you go.
Themis Youth Law and Advocacy.
Thanks to Dawn Post of Themis Youth Law and Advocacy for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at Safe Camp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Onjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elliott. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you'd consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our listeners and readers go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it's very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews, and you can visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can email us at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.